Hello and welcome. My name is Sierra Green, and I work as an archivist at the Heinz History Center in Pittsburgh. Thank you all so much for gathering with us this evening. I'm thankful to be joined by scholars and fellow archivists with whom I deeply respect as we grapple with and explore the challenging history of institutionalization in Pennsylvania. A few housekeeping remarks to start. We have ASL interpretation for the event, which is provided by Center for Hearing and Deaf Services. We also have live captioning provided by ACS Captions. You can access this by clicking on the link in the chat, which will open in a separate window with a live transcript, or you can choose the closed caption button at the bottom of the screen. If you need any technical support or help, you can use the chat at the bottom of your screen. Throughout the event, please do submit questions by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. When contributing to the chat and Q&A, we ask that you please help us maintain a supportive environment. Before we begin with tonight's program, my fellow speakers and I wish to ask everyone to join us in a moment of silence to acknowledge the almost 3 million individual lives lost during the COVID-19 pandemic. In particular, we'd like to dwell on those in congregate care facilities who have died throughout our state and our country. Thank you. The past few years have also seen the loss of key figures in the movement to transition institutionalized people with disabilities back into community. These include Tom Gilhol, Eleanor Elkin, and former Pennsylvania Governor Dick Thornburg. We mourn their loss as well. Just as we struggle to comprehend the scale of loss that we've witnessed in our world this past year, so too is it hard to understand the scale and impact of the historic institutionalization of our fellow Pennsylvanians with disabilities within the mental health community. Institutionalization has profoundly shaped the lives of tens of thousands of people in our state for nearly 200 years. To make the most of our time this evening, here are some parameters that have guided us speakers. Now, while the primary focus of tonight will be on records from institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities, this program will also address access to early records from state hospitals for people with mental illness. We've also decided to concentrate on the time period of the late 1800s through the 1960s, eras in which there are few other resources outside of institutional records which focus on or reflect the people confined at these institutions. Also, most records that date to this time period are open for research. And while we believe it's important to understand the scale of institutionalization, past and present in our state, we want the focus of our attention to be on the individual. But how can we do this when these fellow Pennsylvanians have long since passed away? The answer, however flawed and imperfect, are records and archives. In particular, we'll mostly discuss records created by doctors, nurses, attendants, and other staff of these state-run institutions. I caution you, though, please do not dismiss the heaviness and deeply flawed nature of these records that were inextricably shaped by the system of institutionalization. This means that they bear the markings of outmoded methods of so-called treatments and diagnoses for people with intellectual disabilities and people with mental illness. However problematic, these records do provide us a lens through which to witness what is often a painful glimpse into the individual humanity of an institutionalized person in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Our challenge, as I see it, whether as archivists, genealogists, or scholars or researchers, is to first strain to hear the voices of institutionalized people within these records, and then secondly, to reflect on what we can and cannot learn from these glimpses into the past. It is our hope that you'll emerge from this program empowered to explore this history for yourselves. In that vein, we've prepared handouts and a resource list, as well as a link, and a link to these will be shared in the chat. Now for the run of show this evening. We'll begin with Millersville University Professor Emeritus of History, Dennis Downey, who will familiarize us with the rise of institutionalization and then subsequent deinstitutionalization in our state. From there, archivist Tyler Stump will highlight the types of institutional records that are open for research at the Pennsylvania State Archives. Then we'll speak with scholar and PhD candidate Nathan Stenberg about his research into the case files of institutionalized people. You'll then hear from me about research opportunities at the History Center before we all come back together for a Q&A and roundtable discussion. With that, I'd like to introduce our speakers. Dennis B. Downey is Professor Emeritus of History at Millersville University and co-author of Pennhurst and the Struggle for Disability Rights. The author or editor of 10 books and scores of scholarly articles and essays, Downey chairs the Disability Policy Circle for the Public Interest Law Center of Philadelphia. Tyler Stump is an acquisition archivist at the Pennsylvania State Archives. He primarily works with records that document the history of mental health, institutionalization, prisons, and public health in Pennsylvania. Since he joined the archives in 2016, he has helped collect archival records for more than a dozen state hospitals and centers in Pennsylvania and has written several articles on Pennsylvania's mental institutions. Nathan R. Stenberg is a first-generation disabled artist, personal trainer, and scholar from a low-income, single-parent family in rural Minnesota. He is interested in how the stories we tell about disabled people influence everything from depictions of disability in popular entertainment to policy decisions for the disability community in the United States. Nathan received his BA in music from Roberts Wesleyan College in 2014 and his Master of Divinity from Princeton Seminary in 2017. He is currently a PhD candidate in theater and performance historiography at the University of Minnesota. So without further ado, I'd like to welcome Dennis Downey.
Thank you, Sierra, and it's a pleasure to be with you. And I'd like to thank not only my fellow panelists, but the Heinz Center and all those in attendance tonight for participating in what we hope will be a broad and wide-ranging conversation. My task is to give some kind of historical perspective and overview that will allow, pardon me, the other guests to talk about records that can be used to flesh out the history of disabilities in Pennsylvania. And there's a quote that I would like to begin with, simply to set the tone. And that is, history is something that happens to people. And it's something I hope that we all keep in mind as we move through this evening's program, and that it isn't just an institutional story that we're telling. We are also telling the story of individuals. And we are also telling a broader kind of public policy and social attitude story. So we can think of the convergence of institutions, individuals, and ideology in Pennsylvania and America's development of institutions, and then the countervailing force of deinstitutionalization, or what David Furliger called anti-institutionalization after the Second World War. Let me just walk through some things and kind of set a context. And if we could go to the next slide, please, Sierra. This is a map that shows the distribution of state and semi-state or private institutions that receive state funding in Pennsylvania in 1923. It shows 60 different institutions that covered a variety of different conditions, diagnoses, and social and health needs. They included schools and hospitals for folks who were said to be, quote, feeble-minded. And as I use that word, I want to make note of the problem of language and everything that we're going to talk about, and the evolution of language in talking about folks with a disability. In fact, even the word disability or disabled is controversial in itself today. But this shows the distribution of folks who were consigned to institutions for the feeble-minded and epileptic, tubercular centers, sanatoria of various different kinds, institutions for folks who suffered from alcohol and drug addiction, people who had a mental illness. There were psychiatric hospitals. There were homes for orphans, mothers, soldiers, sailors. Pennsylvania by the 1920s was supporting a broad network of public and semi-public institutions to address a variety of what we're seeing as not just individual problems, but social problems. And so even as I sort of now limit my discussion very briefly to folks who today would be phrased as having an intellectual and developmental disability. We have to understand that it appears in this broad context. And one way to think about it, and if we could go to the next slide, please. This is a quote from Justice Thurgood Marshall, which Tom Gilhool shared with me the first time I met him back in, I guess it was about 2009, 2010. And this is what Thurgood Marshall, Supreme Court Justice and a civil rights advocate, said in a very famous case regarding institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disability. And it's particularly the last line that I'd like folks to concentrate on. Massive custodial institutions were built to warehouse the retarded for life. The aim was to halt reproduction of the retarded, his phrase and the phrase of the day, and quote, nearly extinguish the race. At the turn of the 20th century, and if we could go to the next slide, please. At the turn of the 20th century, there's a convergence of forces that can help us understand the emergence of this public welfare network of institutions, and particularly the rise of institutions for folks who had an intellectual and developmental disability, once called mental retardation, back at the turn of the 20th century, referred to as the feeble-minded, and such language as idiots, imbeciles, morons, social defectives, moral defectives, a very unflattering representation of people and their needs. Charles Fraser was the dean of the University of Pennsylvania Medical School, and he wrote a highly sensational pamphlet in 1908, which was part of a genre. This was the menace of the feeble-minded. And social crusader said, I believe the most important problem we have before us is that of the prevention of mental defect. Greater than problems of any disease, greater than problems of personal and public hygiene, the single great problem that confronted Pennsylvania and America in Charles Fraser's view was the problem of mental defect, or the feeble-minded. And then, as Major Leonard Darwin, Charles Darwin's son, said in 1926 at an international conference, the first duty of medicine is not to cure disease, it is to prevent it. And it is that emphasis on prevention that I want to emphasize. At the turn of the 20th century, there's a convergence of forces. They are the rise of public health, eugenics, and reform, but as these quotes suggest, conservative reform. Eugenics was a scientific and a social movement predicated on the notion of selective breeding. It comes from Charles Darwin's cousin Francis Galton, his book Hereditary Genius, and this very basic notion of a struggle for existence that pitted the fit and the unfit in the great competition of life. And what was argued by both American and European eugenicists was there is an individual and a social interest in encouraging some people to procreate, to reproduce and have children. And there is a societal interest in preventing other people from conceiving and having children. And those others were people with disabilities, and more particularly, they were people said to be, quote, feeble-minded. In Pennsylvania and elsewhere, there were three strategies to achieve this goal of selective breeding. If you can breed a better horse, Why can't you breed a better human being? It was that simple a concept. And to that end, eugenicists promoted the idea of sexual sterilization for females and for males if they had some kind of hereditary defect. They also promoted the idea of anti-marriage laws that criminalize sexual relations and marriage with anyone who had an undesirable trait, if you will. And then the third great issue was institutions. The rise of institutions that intentionally separated and marginalized and segregated people with an intellectual and developmental disability, the feeble-minded. The idea was if you could keep them apart, you could keep them from reproducing. And in the long run, they would wither away. This was not extermination. This was elimination over time. And it was seen in society's best interest. Now, to really condense a long story, in Pennsylvania, the idea of involuntary sterilization, particularly after 1890, was politically untenable. Though proposed 6 times in the state legislature, and it passed twice, it was both measures were vetoed by the governor. So sterilization became a political impossibility. There were numerous attempts to pass anti-marriage statutes, much like anti-miscegenation statutes based on race. But what became the popular solution, particularly to the public health crisis of the feeble-minded, is institutionalization. And you see throughout the very late 19th and the early 20th century, as a part of conservative reform, a growing state commitment. And Pennsylvania was not alone. There were nearly 300 institutions across the country that were dedicated to the segregation and marginalization of people with an intellectual or developmental disability. And the idea was to marginalize them, keep them out of the mainstream, and there better protect society. In Pennsylvania, the Pennsylvania Training School at Elwyn was the first. It came the earliest in 1859 when it moved to Elwyn. In 1897, Polk, or the Institution for the Feeble-Minded of Western Pennsylvania, opened. And then in 1908, Pennhurst, or the Eastern Pennsylvania Institution for the Feeble-Minded and Epileptic, opened. And these were the three great institutions, but there were numerous others at Selinsgrove, at Whitehaven, at Hamburg, and elsewhere across the state. And this network of institutions supported, managed, and funded by the state. Over time, some 10,000 people will take up residence at Polk, a similar number at Pennhurst, and smaller numbers in Selinsgrove and elsewhere. At the same time, the state is opening up mental health hospitals and other kinds of institutions, and you'll hear more about that later, but if we could go to the next slide, please. So from the early 20th century, and this is a picture of the Pennhurst campus, which opened in 1908 and continued to expand until it's closed in 1987. And I think we can go on to the next slide. Down through the Second World War, these are just scenes of Pennhurst. Pennhurst was for both men and women, as was Polk and all of the other institutions. Pennhurst was also interracial, as was Polk and other institutions. There was no racial segregation per se. Men and women were kept separate on the campus, so there was a degree of gender segregation throughout. For each of these campuses, but particularly for Polk and Pennhurst, they grew in size and in scope down through the period of the Second World War. But by the time of the Second World War, there are a growing number of controversies that are surfacing everywhere in Pennsylvania and beyond Pennsylvania. Problems of overcrowding and understaffing, problems of poor finance, problems of infrastructure maintenance, and the growing problem of abuse and physical, sexual, psychological violence, and medical experimentation. These institutions became literal laboratories for the testing of vaccines and other kinds of pharmaceutical products. And especially with the approach of World War II, the federal government was involved in funding much of the research that used institutionalized populations to test vaccines for influenza, meningitis, hepatitis, measles and mumps, and a whole array of other communicable diseases. Probably the most famous is the testing of the Salk vaccine at Polk in the 1950s. But even as these institutions grew, and remember, there were some 60 different institutions throughout the state. Even as they grew, controversies crept into the public light. And so immediately after the Second World War, there were a series of articles published in Life and Look magazine and other periodicals where conscientious objectors who had done their alternative service in Pennsylvania institutions and really institutions across the country began to report what they had seen and they had experienced on the inside. And they wrote to Eleanor Roosevelt, they wrote to the White House, they published articles and images, all of which showed a very different image of institutional life behind these segregated walls. Very different image than what people had expected. And by the late 1940s, very early 1950s, you see the emergence of what David Ferliger called anti-institutionalization, what we refer to as deinstitutionalization, and a long campaign to not only address problems within, but eventually to close these institutions. By the 1950s, and such organizations as the Pennsylvania ARC, the ARC of the United States, and other advocacy groups, through attorneys in court, through the actions of the federal and the state government, and eventually through the testimony and witness of residents themselves, so-called self-advocates, you begin to see some of the horrors of institutional life. The shift from the idea of training and educating, which at some places was given up on very quickly, to the more coercive and custodial warehousing of people, which is what Thurgood Marshall's quote pointed to. And by the early mid-1960s, through the Kennedy administration and the White House committee, and through advocacy in the streets, the emergence of the disability rights movement, the whole question of public policy and disability comes into much clearer focus. What I'd like to just focus on very quickly is Pennhurst and its role in this. And there were scandals and problems at each of the institutions. Polk had its own investigations, and medical personnel were prosecuted for malpractice and mistreatment at Polk. But at Pennhurst, in 1968, Bill Baldini spent 5 days filming at Pennhurst And he was led inside, and his documentary, Suffer the Little Children, which appeared over 5 nights in Philadelphia, gives tremendous exposure to the problems behind these closed doors. The testimony of people like Roland Johnson, that the nighttime was the worst time, the terror moments, when not only staff, but other residents would prey on the young and the innocent and the vulnerable, and the problems of rape and other kinds of sexual abuse and physical violence. And all of this begins to emerge. And then in the early 1970s, through the PR case, through Haldeman versus Pennhurst, through Romeo versus Youngberg, a whole series of legal challenges in an effort to restore constitutional protections to the residents. And what began as an effort to improve institutional life ends up with a movement to close the institutions themselves. And so in 1987, under the weight of all of this controversy, Pennhurst closed. And over time, other institutions closed. Today, we are still involved in controversies over the closing of Polk and Whitehaven. And there are several institutions still open around the state, but the state has committed itself to closing institutions, in part because it's so expensive, though it costs more to keep people in a community than in an institution than it does in the community. But under the weight of all of these controversies, in Pennsylvania and elsewhere, this phenomenon of deinstitutionalization and then the disability rights movement takes hold. Pennhurst closes in 87, and it becomes one of the landmark cases in the rise of disability rights and restoring rights and protections to individuals. The right to go to a public school, the right to receive services, to live free from cruel and unusual punishment. And eventually, through the Olmstead decision and other things, the right to live in a community setting. From exclusion to inclusion, from separation to a return to the mainstream. And even as institutions close, there are huge questions that still exist, and they are part of the archives that you're going to hear about in just a minute. But this question, what do you do with all the vacant space at Pennhurst, in Allentown, at Polk, at Norristown, at Wernersville, the Harrisburg Mental Hospital? What do you do with this space? What is the appropriate way to remember and commemorate? Is it through Halloween-style venues that focus on the macabre? Or is there some more suitable site, some more suitable program of remembrance and commemoration? And even as institutional life has been replaced by life in the community, there are huge and systemic issues that still face us today. And Senator Casey, in his recent proposal for expanding home and community-based services, the Biden administration's proposals to support and train direct support workers, the effort to come back and catch up will be part of public policy debate today. And it raises this question, and this is what I would like to end on. The story of institutionalization, which I've just glossed over, and the kind of coercive incarceration of folks who were called inmates because they were perceived to have a defect. It raises the question, what does it mean to be a citizen? What does it mean to have equal protection under the law? What does human rights encompass in America today? And I think as we turn it over to the archivists, there's a rich treasure trove of resources, and there's also a history to be written, as we tried to do with the Pennhurst book. There is a history to be written that focuses on social attitudes, public policy, the institutions, and the individuals themselves. And Pennsylvania is ripe for further investigation in that regard. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. Give me one moment while I get everything started on my end. Okay. Hopefully we can all see this okay. So good evening, everyone. I'm so glad to be here with you all, and I just want to thank again Sierra and the staff at the Hine Center for putting this event on. There's a lot of names that I recognize in the audience. I'm glad you're all here. My name is Tyler Stump, and I work at the State Archives over in Harrisburg. And like Sierra mentioned, I'm an acquisitions archivist, which means my normal job is traveling around the state and collecting records of historical value and bringing them to the archives for preservation and access. So it's nice to have a little bit of a change of pace for me and talk to people about the records that we do have and tell you about how you can come and use them so that you can kind of delve into the history like Dennis has done and like Nathan, who you'll hear from after me. But yeah, I'm really excited to talk about these records, and no matter if you're a genealogist looking for one particular person who was at a state-run institution, or if you're a historian or any other kind of researcher, I think the resources and the records we have at the state archives will really help you a lot. And I just think this stuff is so important because having access to these records, it should help shed light on the experience of disability and institutionalization in Pennsylvania. And that's just such an important thing. And so we want to try and make sure that these records are being used. You know, we're preserving them now, but we want to make sure that they actually are, you know, impacting people now today too. So I should note first, I made a handout for everyone, which Sierra has kindly put in the collection of resources that she's distributed. So if you missed something on one of my slides, or if I say something and you weren't able to catch it, it's probably in the handout because I tried to make that as inclusive as possible. But the State Archives, we were founded in 1903. Actually, our birthday was yesterday, so we're 118 years old now. And we've been helping folks learn about Pennsylvania history ever since from our home in Harrisburg. And I hope that you will come visit us when the pandemic is over and we're open again. We're just a block away from the state capitol downtown. So our mission is to acquire, preserve, and make available for study the permanently valuable public records of the Commonwealth, particularly the records of state government. And so what does this mean? It means that the State Archives is the official repository for the records of any state-run institution in Pennsylvania that has ever existed. And that also means that we are the official repository for any records created by the State Department of Human Services, or as it was called before, the Department of Public Welfare, or any other state agencies or offices involved with disability policy, operating of state institutions, or any other office that impacts Pennsylvanians with disabilities or mental illnesses. Just in the last 5 years, we've collected over 300 cubic feet of records from Pennsylvania state institutions, and that's on top of the other large collections that we've already had for a long time. So we really do have a really massive collection related to these state-run institutions, the people who lived in them, also the people who worked in them and operated them. So we're really the best source to have everything all in one place to really do any kind of research and history related to these institutions. I have here on the map, a map that I made of where all these institutions are. Since the 1850s, Pennsylvania has operated a lot of different institutions. Most of them were state hospitals, which would have housed Pennsylvanians who were diagnosed to have mental illnesses or psychiatric disorders. State centers also were pretty prevalent across the state, which have historically housed people with intellectual disabilities, epilepsy, and other developmental disorders. And then there are other institutions such as industrial homes, penitentiaries, reformatories, veterans homes, orphans homes, those sorts of things. And since the 1850s, literally hundreds of thousands of Pennsylvanians with disabilities were institutionalized in these various facilities over the years. So like I said, the State Archives is the place to go for the records of these institutions and the state government offices, but we don't have everything. There's definitely a large chunk of this story that is not kind of in the record collections that we have at the archives. Most of the records that we have are administrative records or records of individuals who were in an institution. So you won't find records that are created by people who were institutionalized themselves or kind of records from their perspective. We also don't have many records that were created by their family members, advocates, or disability rights groups, unless they were corresponding or directly working with the state in some capacity. We also don't have many records from other institutions that were in Pennsylvania, but were operated either by the federal government or a county or a local government, or if they were run privately. We have a small amount here and there, but it's nothing that's really in depth. Those are usually held by other archives in the state. And we also don't have a lot of detailed records from like the 1980s up through the present. A lot of those records are still in use by the state government, so they haven't transferred to the archives yet. And the ones that we do have, a lot of times those are not available for access yet because they still have some restrictions on them due to privacy laws and other things like that. I would definitely say our collections at the archives are the most in-depth from about the 1870s and up through the 1940s and 50s in general. So all this information on my slides, like I said before, it's going to be on the handout, but I just wanted to mention some of the institutions that we have large collections of records from. The first one is those state centers that I mentioned, and that's where Dennis was mentioning with Pennhurst and Polk. Those ones that were for people who have intellectual disabilities. Some of the strongest collections that we have are from Laurelton, Pennhurst, and Polk centers. We also have a lot of records from different state hospitals. I think the largest collections are Danville, Dixmont, and Harrisburg state hospitals. And we also have sizable records from Mayview, Norristown, Warren, and Woodville state hospitals. And so these cover a large swath of Pennsylvania. A lot of them served a lot of the counties, not just kind of immediately in their area, but also in much larger areas outside of them. So you might have an ancestor who was in an institution and they could have lived somewhere like, I don't know, maybe Erie County, but they could have been in an institution down in Allegheny County, closer to Pittsburgh, something like that. That's a fairly common thing. So if you're doing research, be prepared to kind of look at different hospitals and facilities that are all across the state. We also have a lot of records from other sorts of institutions that weren't explicitly for people with disabilities or mental illnesses. And a lot of those, our strongest collections are from state penitentiaries and reformatories also as well. And the reason that I brought up all these different types of institutions and how they were kind of designed for specific purposes is the reason that I found a lot of times just looking through these records myself and helping a lot of researchers who are trying to track down individuals is that a single person who is institutionalized can often move between separate institutions in the course of their lifetime. A great example of this is Harry Morton Smith, who was the first patient who was admitted to Pennhurst in 1908. And he spends a couple of years at Pennhurst and then he's discharged. And then a few years later, we find him back in the record at Harrisburg State Hospital, and then he's discharged again after a few years. And then he shows up in the records at Wernersville State Hospital, which is in Berks County, and eventually he passed away there. Another example is Lewis Henry Ross, who was originally incarcerated at the Reformatory in Huntington for a few years. He's released. Later, he's incarcerated again at Western State Penitentiary in Pittsburgh. And there, the records say that he suffered, quote, a nervous breakdown, and he's transferred to Farview State Hospital, and he remains there for about 30 years afterwards. Depending on changes in somebody's legal status, their medical diagnosis, if the staff consider their condition to have changed, and sometimes even requests from parents or the individuals themselves, these individuals can move around a lot. So all this to say, when you're researching an individual or even a group of people who were in a state-run institution, be prepared to look in many different places. Sometimes the records will lead you there very easily. Other times you might need to do a little bit of careful research to kind of track someone down and get their fuller story. So in the time that I have left today, I'd just like to talk about the different kind of categories of records that we have in the state archives. From every institution generally in the state that's ever operated, we have a good variety of administrative records that were usually created by the executive staff, like the superintendent, also administrative staff, physicians, and other medical staff. And so these will include things like official correspondence, policy records, which could include diagnosis and admission policies or work policies, if there were, labor programs in a lot of these institutions, recreation, all sorts of things, ward operations. And we also have other things like annual reports and meeting minutes and maps. So they're all a great resource. These records, and especially those from kind of the 1800s and early 1900s, they're really candid, I think, and they can tell you a lot about how these institutions were operated and what general experiences were like. So you may not find something on a particular individual who you're looking for, but I think you can kind of look at these records and learn kind of about general lived experiences at them. And you can kind of use that to understand what it might have been like for an individual who you might not have a lot of other information in the records for. So I definitely would suggest not ignoring these records, even if you're trying to do kind of specific genealogical work. They really help you get a picture of like what the bigger picture looks like, I guess. But the other records that we have, and probably what most of you are most interested in, are going to be the records of individuals who were institutionalized at these facilities in Pennsylvania. And I just want to note first, a lot of times these records, the official term for them is patient records. And that's the terminology you'll see in the records themselves. If you contacted the state hospital or a state center today, they're typically going to use the term patient. And I just wanted to note that's, considering especially what Dennis has talked about, looking back historically at these institutions where we know that patient isn't always the most appropriate term, especially when there were a lot of individuals who were not receiving adequate or any care at all. Patient isn't always adequate, but that's the language that's in the records. So that's just something to be aware of. And kind of building off that and just with language, because that is a really important thing to consider when we do this research. These records can be really hard to read, and not just like they're hard to read because the handwriting's hard or something, but just I think kind of emotionally, they can be really charged reading them today in the 21st century, especially if you're looking at one of your family members or somebody who you've been researching for a while. These records are written from the perspective of the staff at the institution and kind of it's their view on things. So these records are clinical. They can often be demeaning in how they describe individuals, and they can be really cold reading them today. So I would just, maybe not as a warning, but just as something to expect when you're looking through these records. And I'm sure Nathan will talk about this a little bit more, but that's just, I think it's a really important thing to kind of be prepared for what's in these records, because it can be disturbing sometimes. So that's something that's in them. So anyways, the main types of individual or patient records that we have are admission and discharge records, master card indexes, case files, and then cemetery or burial records. So let's talk about each of those a little bit more closely. Admission and discharge records, that's usually kind of the initial records that's created for an individual when they come to the institution. And they're usually compiled in large ledger books and written out in tabular form. For each individual, there's usually their name and their basic information. So their background, what county did they come from? Sometimes what was their occupation? What was their initial diagnosis? What date did they actually enter and leave the institution? And sometimes there's a few other things like that. And these are a really good place to start for research. They're usually very complete unless, a page or a volume is missing for some reason, but that's a very rare occurrence, thankfully. So this is a good place to start when you're doing your research. And I have here up on the screen a sample page from Harrisburg State Hospital, their admission and discharge register. It's got a couple columns for each person and gives their kind of basic biographical background. And thankfully, a lot of our older admission and discharge ledgers have been digitized, and we put them up online on our website, the Pennsylvania Power Library. And I have a link to that in the handout that I gave out too. The next kind of record is what's called master patient card indexes. And these are alphabetical groups of cards. One is created for each patient. They were usually used in the medical records office in an institution to quickly track down an individual and their basic information. And there's a lot more information on these cards than what you'll find in an admission register. Although the other the problem, I guess you could say, with these records is oftentimes some of the cards may be missing. So sometimes we'll have individuals who we know they were there because they show up in the admission record, but we're missing their cards, so we don't have all the information. So sometimes they're limited. Usually they're either lost or they never arrived at the archive, so we never received them in the first place for whatever reason. But in general, they're a good resource to have as well. And here's an example of one individual who's at Mayview State Hospital in 1919. So you can see he has a lot more information here than what was in that other admission register that we looked at. But you can also see here in the middle, there's a line for relatives. And it actually lists his father, this individual, and his father was also institutionalized at the same institution 2 years earlier. And I did check, and we have all the records for this person's father as well. So that may be something, and especially I know for you genealogists, the family information that can be in these records is also, it's right there, and it's usually pretty useful to look at as well. And here's the back of that card. So this one isn't fully filled out, but most of the other ones are, but you can just see the types of categories of information that's typically included on these cards. Most of them are typed, although some of the older ones are handwritten, so sometimes they're a little bit of a struggle to read, but they're not that bad. And sometimes there'll actually be multiple cards stapled together for one individual, so you may even have additional information, especially for those who were institutionalized for a long period of time. The next type of record are what are called patient case files. And I think Nathan will talk about these a little bit more. These are the full files for individuals, and they have lots and lots of detailed information across many pages about an individual's admission, their diagnosis, their time at the institution. They often talk about any medical procedures or operations that were performed while they were there, or injuries that occurred. They'll talk about work duties they may have been assigned or recreational activities they participated in, and any change in their diagnosis or unusual events. If somebody ran away or escaped, or if they had visits from family, that's usually noted. So lots of good information. Here's an example of one young man who was at Pennhurst State School and Hospital, or later Pennhurst Center, in 1909. I just have a couple pages on the screen. I think it was a 15-page case file for him. But this one's really nice. It's got his photograph in it. The second page up at the top, it actually has a section for family and personal history, which tells you a lot about, for this man whose name was, I'm not seeing it really quickly, Herbert Carter, sorry. It tells you about his background and so his family and everything like that. So these are really the gold mines of information. But like the card file, sometimes some of these are missing. For whatever reason, they were separated from the kind of main records area at the institution. They never made it to us, which is unfortunate. But for the most part, we have the bulk of these for most people. So these are a great source of information. The next type of record I wanted to talk about is cemetery and burial records. And I saw that there were a couple of questions in the chat about this, so I want to talk about this a little bit too. Not every institution in Pennsylvania had a cemetery, although most did, especially the older ones that were established in the 19th century. Typically, patients or individuals are going to be buried on the ground if their family did not claim the body, if they passed away while they were institutionalized, or if when they died, they had some sort of contagious disease and they were worried about its spread. So we have a lot of folks who die of the influenza pandemic in 1918 who are buried in institutional hospitals. A couple of people asked what happens if somebody is not in the cemetery there, where do they go from there? Usually the family will come and claim the body, so that's the typical thing, and their admission and discharge records will typically note that. When they're discharged, they usually say patient deceased, the family claimed the body, and it'll usually list where they were buried. There are other times when the body was not claimed by family, or they didn't have known family to take the body, where the state anatomical board would actually come and then their body would be donated to science. The state anatomical board was established in 1883, and it was a state office, which we have all of their records as well for everyone who was, I guess, part of that, part of their work. And those bodies would be donated to science, so typically a medical school in Pennsylvania, either in Pittsburgh or Philadelphia. So we will have those records as well. So if you're looking for someone, the tricky thing with institutional cemeteries is typically the headstones only have a patient number inscribed on them, so they won't actually have a name, which is a whole nother conversation to have. And that was a practice that was changed in the 70s, but most of these cemeteries were not actually still burying anybody at that point. So it's an issue. Definitely not something to unpack here, but that's something we could talk about later. But what I wanted to say is we have a lot of cemetery maps and burial lists. We also have good contacts with all of the people who maintain these cemeteries. Some are still run by the institutions that are there. Other ones, if the institution closed, we have contact with whoever currently maintains them. Sometimes it's a local municipality, or if it's a private entity that bought the land. Sometimes you have to arrange with them to go and look at the cemetery and visit a grave site. So we can definitely help you with that. Here on the screen, I have a map from Woodville State Hospital, which was another Allegheny County institution. And we have here, you can see where all the burial plots are. And then up kind of around the edges of this map are lists of all the names. And Woodville, I think this one is, I think the local municipality runs this one now, but this is a small cemetery compared to some of the other ones. So that's definitely, that can be something if you're doing your research and you're trying to find kind of the final resting place, whether it's at the institution or whether it was with the state anatomical board and that body was donated to science and then cremated and buried somewhere else, we can help you with that for sure. So other than those individual types of records that I mentioned, we have a variety of other kind of non-administrative records, which could be photographs and films, newsletters that were written by patients, correspondence with the governor and state officials, which are usually written by formerly institutionalized individuals or their family members. And we also have department records like audits and other types of things like that, inspections, I guess you could call them. And I would definitely recommend, whether you're a historian or you're a genealogist or any other sort of research, don't sleep on these ones, because like the administrative stuff, they'll tell you a lot about the lived experiences at these institutions, and they'll fill in any gaps that you might find in your individual person's records that we may be missing. So luckily, between these and between the several different types of individual records, which kind of overlap and kind of information is duplicated in multiple places, we have at least some level of information about just about everyone who was institutionalized in a state-run institution in the state. So that's, I think that's good that we have that. So the volume is definitely a challenge when you're doing your research, but our staff, and not just me, but we have a great reference team, and they can definitely help you kind of wade through these records as you're going through them. And these are just a couple of my favorite photographs. Both of these come from Polk Center up in northwestern Pennsylvania. But we have thousands and thousands and thousands of photographs like these that really illustrate and kind of bring alive what it was actually like at different points in time in these institutions. So it's not everything, but it's definitely, it can help kind of color what you're looking at in the paper or the textual records. Now, for coming to the archives and looking at the records, I want to talk about access really quickly, and then I'll wrap up. So at the archives, all non-patient or non-individual records are totally open for research with no restrictions. But due to state law, we're required to restrict individual patient records from access unless the record itself is 75 or more years old, or if the individual has been deceased for 50 or more years. And so typically you'd have to provide a death certificate or an obituary or something like that. If you haven't hit those different thresholds, you're either going to have to be the executor of that person's estate, or you're going to have a court order or a doctor's note. So there's really a lot of restrictions on those more recent records. But that being said, we do have a waiver process if you're trying to do a scholarly research project, where you would have to have a plan to protect the privacy of anyone with more recent records, but you'd be allowed to look at everything. There are some records that are still stored out at the institutions that are still open, and they are less accessible, but we could also help you get in touch with those staff there as well. Definitely recommend always calling ahead before you come and visit, just to make sure that you can actually look at all the records that you want to and make sure they're open. But like I said, we try and make as much as we can available, but just we are limited by some state laws which apply to us, which apply to all records related to patients to protect their privacy and confidentiality. And also, I mentioned before, we have been scanning some records. Usually they're 19th century records, and they're available on our Power Library website, which I have a link to in the handout. Also, if you're not available to visit us in Harrisburg, I hope you can, but if not, please give us a call or send us an email. Just share as much information about the individual that you're looking for if you know, and we'd be more than happy to do a search for you and share what we can find, or scan records and send them to you directly. But again, just because we have so many records, as much information as you can share with us is always going to be better to help make sure we can find that person. All right, I hope I didn't go over my time too much. I want to wrap up there I just want to say, please feel free to get in touch with me at any point if you're interested in doing research at the state archives, or just if you have questions about state-run institutions. We have a pretty good handle on what we have, but also the records we know no longer exist for whatever reason. Looking at 50 different state-run institutions over the course of 170 years is a lot, and not everything has survived. But we can definitely help get you to what is around and what will help you with your project, no matter what it is. I'm going to try and answer some of the questions that you've been asking, and then I'll be around in the question and answer session. So I'm just going to hand things off to Nathan. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Tyler. And thanks to Dennis earlier. There's just such a wealth of information that both of you conveyed. So from this point, I'm going to spend some time with Nathan, and we're going to discuss some of your experience doing research within these institutionalized institutional records. So to start, can you give us a little bit of background on what led you to do research within these case files of institutionalized people at the State Archives?
Yeah, so I first became interested in institutionalization, the historical and ongoing process, I should add, of the institutionalization of disabled people while taking class at the University of Minnesota's law school in bioethics and biomedicine. My research initially focused on the Willowbrook State School on Staten Island, but then I moved my focus to Pennhurst State School in Spring City because it now operates as a haunted house. And as I started to immerse myself in Pennhurst history, I knew as a disabled person that in order to get a complete picture of Pennhurst's history, I had to learn the stories of those who lived and died there. And that is ultimately what brought me to the case files at the State Archives. As a researcher, I'm primarily located in the field of performance studies, and I say that because I'm not a historian, and a large chunk of our panelists today come from that discipline. And I use performance as a methodological lens to examine both the archival research, such as the case files, and I also conduct ethnographic research. So in the case files, I look at how the language used to describe people in those files performs socializing action within the context of institutions. In other words, I examine how these files create and perpetuate the idea that disabled people are inferior to non-disabled people. And then in my field work with the attraction, I talk with survivors of the Pennhurst State School and Hospital and the people who work at the Pennhurst Asylum attraction to create oral histories as a way to document the history of institutionalization from the people in which experience it. And there I use performance as a lens to examine how people participate in or challenge the production and reproduction of embodied perceptions of disability that these case files produce.
That's fantastic. So it's clear that these case files are just a key piece within the larger array of the incredible research that you're currently undertaking. I'm wondering if you can help us out. Thus far, we've had a really rich bird's eye view of the history of institutionalization and researching the history of institutionalized people. So can you help us zoom in a little bit and share with us perhaps a story of a person that you've come to know more about through these types of records?
Yes, I would love to share with you the story of Eugene Bender. Eugene was institutionalized at Pennhurst. From what I can gather from his file, as you can see, it's not all too entirely different from what Tyler showed in a slideshow, but Eugene lived with what we would now call cerebral palsy, which is a disability that I live with. And despite being described in his file as generally healthy and very affectionate, Eugene experienced some physical limitations regarding his CP. Now, his parents divorced, and his father seemingly felt that he could no longer provide care at home for Eugene, which was quite common, especially during this time. And he eventually, the father, applied to commit Eugene to Pennhurst. And so Eugene lived at Pennhurst for 7 years until he died, according to the file, suddenly without any special warning. I'm not convinced of that, but that is what the file states. And so when I looked at this file, I examined the death certificate, and I'll scroll down here to show that. And if you look here, it's hard to read, but the medical examiner lists the primary reason for death as his cerebral palsy. does not give a contributing factor, and doesn't even complete an autopsy. And then on top of that, in this file, we have this condolence letter from Pennhurst superintendent, which I should add is actually rather rare for a superintendent to take the time to write a parent like this. But in this condolence letter, Albert H. Super, the superintendent, says, quote, "While we regret very much that your son had to pass out of this life, still, we cannot but feel that in the hopeless condition he was in, it was for the best." Now, when I read that, my stomach sank and I almost started crying in the reading room of the State Archives. Talk about awkward. I felt like I knew Eugene, and to discover this history where people thought people like me, like Eugene and other disabled people were better off dead than alive really hit home. And I think it's really important that when we're looking through these files, that we think about those stories in the way that these were humans and not just documents.
I guess on that note, Nathan, I'd love to ask just how do you feel like you go about the process of trying to reconstitute the lives of these institutionalized people that you get a glimpse into just with these case files?
Of course. Oddly enough, as I mentioned before, I'm not a historian, right? I'm an opera singer by trade. I work as an actor, and honestly, that background has come really to help in this experience, because while I've been learning how to do proper archival techniques and all of this on the historical side of things, my artist background helps me to kind of piece together these bits and pieces that are found in the files, because they're rather limited. Oftentimes you don't, Eugene's file was quite an expansive one, and you don't get to see all of what you did with Eugene in a lot of these, because some of them can just be one page of an admission file and others can have a whole host of information on that person. So when I'm trying to learn more about someone at Pennhurst, I'm interested in where they grew up, who their parents were, what they did for a living, whether they lived with an apparent or non-apparent disability. And one of my particular favorites is looking for what kind of quirks the case files may or may not mention about the person. Often they'll mark kind of like adjectives about, oh, they're affectionist or they're a bit cantankerous, right? So and so will like to spin stories, and I love those kinds of notes, because even though you can tell in the language that these files are written, it's definitely viewed in a diminutive, negative way. That it's almost as if the person is breaking through this form, this structure, in which is supposed to dehumanize them and say, aha, actually I have a personality and I do have these things that you might not approve of, but it's what makes me me. And those are the kinds of things that I really try to look for when I'm going through these files in my research and trying to create a holistic story about who these people were.
I think those are incredibly helpful insights, Nathan. And I guess I'm wondering if, based on what we've shared, is there anything else more that you'd like to talk about as far as what you see to be the opportunities and limitations in these types of records and doing research in this way at the State Archives?
Yeah, well, as I mentioned before, there's a lot of limitations to these documents, and it's easy to kind of harp on those. I think that the most significant opportunity is that it is a chance to tell a story of someone largely forgotten about and thought of as less than human. Another opportunity that these materials present is to cross-examine the ways in which we thought about disability before and how that might lead to better solutions for caregiving, disability-related policy, and a whole host of other questions, especially as we start thinking about conversations around preservation and commemoration. Are we simply forcing disabled people who were put into this mold of non-disabled society back into this mold of non-disabled society by assuming that our ways of preservation, and by our ways, I mean kind of the traditional institutions of history and preservation, are the ways in which the disability community want to remember themselves? And I would say largely in terms of limitations, the biggest is the language. As you saw both in terms of Tyler's presentation and my own, the language here is just physically hard to read because it's all in cursive, you know, the files are old and it can be a bit of a struggle. And then the second part of it is it's primarily written in medical model language, or viewing the person as having a disability in which is a biological fact about themselves and an inherent problem that needs to be fixed. And that can be grating, because even though supposedly the first mission of these people was to provide care, it doesn't always come off that way when reading the files.
You know, this reminds me of some of our earlier conversations in which you mentioned just the personal connections that would spring to your mind from your childhood as you were undertaking this research. And I'm wondering if you could share some of those with our audience this evening.
Of course. You know, and as I mentioned before with Eugene's file, this project for me, I've been doing this now close to 4 years, and it's extremely overwhelming and emotional in a lot of ways. Because as a disabled person, I've never been institutionalized. I do not know what it is like to be existing in a custodial institution. And I'm very careful to note that positionality. However, I have spent considerable amount of my childhood at the Shriners Hospital for Children in Minneapolis, which is in many ways kind of the you know, for the after effects of Pennhurst and the closing of these institutions, that I received such wonderful care. But I have two competing memories that often come to mind when I think about this question. And that is, the first is the nurses taking a radio flyer wagon across the hospital with all of my patient files. I had so many patient files that they couldn't even carry them, right? They had to use a wagon to carry them across the hospital. And the second is, I think of wheelchair racing as a child and these kind of moments of play, right? Like we used to race around the hospital in our wheelchairs and piss the nurses off, much to our glee, and just kind of, you know, have these moments of joy. And so I think about that, and I think about my research in that if you were to look at my life based on what you found in those files, what would you see? You'd see that I've undergone probably close to 20 surgeries. I've learned how to walk and relock a bunch of times. I was once labeled retarded, the eventual effects of feeble-minded, right? I was told I was not going to have a normal life or graduate high school or go to college. And you'd see that I'd gone back and forth from a wheelchair to walkers to crutches to leg braces. But you wouldn't see, you know, that I'm the first person in my family to go to college, let alone go on and pursue doctoral studies. You wouldn't have seen that I have family and friends that I love and who love me. And more importantly, that I have hobbies that are now completely erased by graduate studies. Things that I'm particularly good at and things that I'm not so good at, right? So that's really what lands to me as I think about this and my own experiences of hospitalization and how my life as a disabled person has been put into these patient files, albeit very differently. But nonetheless, I share that lineage with these folks that I research.
Nathan, I'm just so deeply appreciative for you taking the time to just share all of these incredible insights as well as personal reflections. I guess I have one more question for you for now, and that's just thinking about the folks that are on the other end of this webinar. Just wondering if you could share any kind of recommendations or tips, wisdom from your experiences thus far doing research in the archives. What would you impart to these folks in the audience?
Of course. Well, as I've learned from Dr. Downey, a dear mentor and friend of mine, leave them with threes, and that's what I'll do. My first piece of advice is remember that institutionalization of disabled people is not a static historical concept, right? How we understand institutionalization, how we understand what we do with formal institutionalizations, none of this is something that is set in stone. And more importantly, we really need to challenge the set of power relations and other things that go into influence how we think about commemoration. And again, as I mentioned before, are we simply fitting into the mold of what was before because it's easiest or what we think is more important, or is it something else? This requires us as scholars and advocates and lay people to dig into the myriad of ways in which institutionalization continues to define our society and shape the lives of disabled people.
Hmm.
The second thing is remember that we are people and not just documents. We, like all things, possess value, dignity, and demand your utmost respect. It's, excuse me, it's easy to see us as just derived from our diagnoses or our patient charts. And I'd like for those who are wanting to go into these files to think about if someone tried to tell your life story from the notes taken from your annual physical, would that represent who you are and what your life amounts to? And more importantly, what you would want other people to know about you. And then finally, be kind to yourself, give yourself grace, and trust your archivist. Special shout out to Tyler Stout. In that reading through these materials is not easy. It is overwhelming at times, and likely you're not going to find what you want in it either. But if you give yourself grace, if you're kind to yourself, you're kind to your archivist, and you trust them, you're going to find new things that you didn't expect to. And I think that's the number one thing to remember.
Nathan, again, I just can't thank you enough for those incredible scholarly insights as well as personal reflections. Just your perspective is so deeply appreciated and valued. And I'm really eager to bring everyone back together for our Q&A. So that'll be coming after I give a little bit of an overview of what we have at the Heinz History Center related to deeply flawed records pertaining to institutionalized people. So I'm going to share my screen and we'll dig in. So just a little bit of background to start. The Heinz History Center is a history museum based in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, and our focus is on Western Pennsylvania history. Now, as Tyler mentioned, while most records relating to institutionalization are at the Pennsylvania State Archives, we do have some materials at the History Center relating to this history. Now, why is that, you might wonder? And the answer in some ways is quite straightforward. Some of these institutions were located in our region. Of course, people from this region served on the boards, worked at these institutions, and of course, thousands of Western Pennsylvanians were confined at these institutions. So it follows that some of the evidence, including books, documents, photographs, as well as artifacts, would have stayed here locally. Before we continue, and it's been very evident throughout the course of this program thus far, this is really hard and difficult history. And I want to acknowledge that some of the examples of collections that I'll share throughout my presentation, folks might find really painful and harmful to encounter. So I just want to make sure to acknowledge that. I also want to just deliver a brief caveat saying that I am highlighting just some of the resources that we have available at the History Center. Please don't consider this a comprehensive overview. That's what our online catalogs are for. And then also, similar to Tyler, there is a handout that has been shared with you with links pertinent for these collections. The first collection I want to begin with is a collection of receipts dating to the earliest eras of Polk Center's operation. So they ran from 1903 to 1914, and they were transferred to us from the Pennsylvania State Archives. I employ researchers not to sleep on this collection. For me, there are so many research questions that you can ask of this collection that I think perhaps these aggregate of materials may only be able to answer. Some of those examples include, you can see week after week, month after month, year after year, detailed itemized lists of the types of medications that were being ordered and administered to people confined at Polk. You can also, I think, begin to interrogate the ways in which administrators utilize taxpayer funds to maintain the system of institutionalization. And this is during an era in which Polk is already growing beyond capacity in these first couple decades of its operation here in Western Pennsylvania. There are also, I think, some surprising storylines that you can explore at least briefly within these records. So this is an example of a receipt that was turned in 1906 by a Polk physician. This physician traveled to Baltimore, and he traveled to Baltimore to apprehend a boy who had escaped from Polk. And when I look at this record, I think of the incredible ingenuity and the determination and the desperation that this boy must have had to travel from northwestern Pennsylvania successfully all the way to Baltimore before being apprehended by a Polk physician and returned to the institution. Now, We understand that wading through thousands of receipts would be daunting to a researcher of any stripe. So we've undertaken a project working with the History Center volunteer to extract the relevant data points of each receipt and put it in a spreadsheet so researchers can really dig in and do an array of different level of analyses in order to, again, take a critical look into how this institution utilized taxpayer funds to maintain the system of institutionalization. And I just want to thank and call out particularly former History Center volunteer Emily Dolan. She entered over 5,000 receipts. So this project is very much so in process, and we're eager to continue it. Now, keeping in the vein of Polk Center, we also have a collection of artifacts that relates to this institution. The most profoundly troubling of those is a numbered tombstone. So you heard this referenced in Tyler's talk. This is tombstone number 573. Now, it's come up in the Q&A that these institutions for decades did not extend the dignity of putting a name on the resting place of people who were confined at Polk and at other institutions and were buried on site in the cemeteries. And thanks to a list that was donated to us by Polk Center alongside this tombstone, we are able to restore the humanity to tombstone number 573. So we learned that Margaret DeMarco, from her death certificate, that she spent nearly half her life confined at Polk before she passed away at the age of 17 in 1938. Now, taking a cue from Nathan, I looked more closely at this death certificate, and we see again that in this instance, an intellectual disability is a reference as far as a secondary cause of this 17-year-old's death in 1938. Now, switching over to a different institution, Dixmont State Hospital, we do have an array of sources that speak to this particular hospital for people with mental illness. The first source that leapt out to me was a collection, an index of burials that ran from the 1860s through the 1930s. And it's really primed for genealogical use. So the names of people who were confined, died, and buried at Dixmont are listed in alphabetical order. And if we examine this listing, this index more closely, we see that Dixmont also engaged in the deeply troubling and dehumanizing practice of just numbering the graves at their particular cemetery. So we do have a small collection of Dixmont Hospital records that were donated to us by a physician, or a psychologist rather, who worked at Dixmont. In thinking about the mission of this program for this evening, I really wanted to seek out and find source materials that at least provide some glimpse or individually depict someone who was institutionalized there. And I did come across a very small collection of letters that were written by people confined at Dixmont. One example on this slide is a letter written in 1921. And it's quite remarkable when we give it a close read. It's a man sending a letter to his wife, really pleading for her to assist him in being discharged from Dixmont. And he goes on to share the plans that he has in place for their life after he's able to rejoin society, and just closes the letter out by again finishing off with a plea to help him get out of this institution. So again, very brief, very poignant, and very few, but still we do have some sources like this within our Dixmont Hospital records. There are also within this collection references, not in-depth information, but references to quote unquote treatments, such as electroshock therapy, hydrotherapy, restraints, seclusion, castration, as well as lobotomies these measures were taken against people confined at Dixmont. There are also in this collection an array of photographs that date from the 1910s to the 1970s. I have one example that's on the slide, and it's a pretty bleak view of a ward at Dixmont. And what we see is wireframe bed after bed after bed after bed after bed in the same room. And when we examine the image, the windows more closely, we see that there is metal barring, which just further reaffirms the culture of confinement that were at these institutions, such as Dixmont. And we also have some other Dixmont Hospital records that came in more recently in 2011, and it's a pretty sizable collection, about 19 boxes. And again, thinking about records that at least individually name people who were confined at Dixmont. We see ward day and night reports that again were created by staff, as well as restraint and seclusion orders. These materials date to the 1930s and 1940s, and again just really kind of reflect really troubling measures that were taken against people that were confined at Dixmont, including restraints, a mention of a dark room, as well as the use of straitjackets throughout, again, the era of the 1930s and 1940s. We also have administrative records, but since that's not the focus of the evening, I'm going to move on. We also have a collection of original letters from Dorothea Dix, a 19th century reformer who was involved in the creation of Dixmont Hospital. A selection of these letters have been digitized and put up online on the Historic Pittsburgh website. There's a link in the handout. And we want to thank our friends at PHMC and the Pennsylvania State Archives for underwriting this work to digitize those letters. We also have collections relating to other institutions that I haven't dwelt upon tonight. These include the Pennsylvania Reform School, also known as Morganza, as well as Thornhill School for Boys. So if you're interested in Thornhill School for Boys, make sure to keep an eye out on the Historic Pittsburgh website. There will be a collection of historic photographs that will be going up online, as well as an index that will be created for the records that individually identify the boys who were confined at this reform school. I also want to briefly highlight collections that relate to topics connected to institutionalization, of which we have growing strengths at the History Center, and that's in large part thanks to our partnership with the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. So we have materials relating to the topic of deinstitutionalization, and they include the Bob Nelkin collection of ACC Park records, as well as the Pat Clapp papers and photographs. These are incredibly rich collections that document the work of grassroots advocates and parents who went on the ground and made site visits to these institutions in the 1970s and exposed the abuse, neglect, as well as human rights violations at these state institutions for people with intellectual and developmental disabilities. The people who feature prominently in these collections include Bob Nelkin, Pat Clapp, Ginny Thornburg, Jean Isherwood, Barbara Sistick, and many more. I am so thankful to be able to share that a number of these records, hundreds of them, have been scanned, digitized, and put up online, and they are keyword searchable. Again, on Historic Pittsburgh, the links are in your handout. Incredibly rich collections that I think that there are so many research opportunities for. We also have a collection that came in more recently from the Ark of Allegheny, which is a part of Achieva for those of you from Western Pennsylvania. There's one key source that came in with this collection, and it's known colloquially as the Delp Diary. It was kept by Russ Delp, who was an undercover investigator at Western Center. And in 1989, he exposed instances of staff abuse, and his work really contributed to the closure of Western Center. We also have some records relating to the story of community inclusion. So two collections in particular, Siobhan Hensel papers and photographs, as well as the Paula and Jolene Elder papers and photographs. So on this slide, we have Siobhan Hensel, who has slyly slid over to the driver's seat of her sister Denise's car. And Denise was able to take a picture of this image. And Denise had shared with us facets of her personality, including her sharp sense of humor, as well as her really, she took a lot of joy in pulling pranks on people that she loved. So Siobhan was born in 1961, and her parents resisted medical recommendations at the time to institutionalize her. And so she was able to spend her youth and her full life with her family, and her collection really richly documents that. It also documents the challenges that she encountered in community-based group homes. And so her collection really powerfully reflects the ongoing struggle to improve community-based supports and group homes for people with disabilities. And before I move on, I just want to make a note of, again, thanking the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium for their partnership, their wisdom, their lived experiences, as well as to the generosity of the Hensel and Elder families, and in particular, Denise Hensel and Paula Elder, whose generosity resulted in the History Center having the honor of preserving these incredible collections. So I have just a few research tips, because it's my goal not only for you to emerge more informed, but also more empowered to do this research. So first and foremost, I think the best place to start is by looking at our online catalogs. So we have one for the library and the archives, so those papers, documents, films, photographs, as well as books. And then we also have a catalog for our museum, which searches our artifacts, our three-dimensional objects. I really recommend starting with the names of the institution, regardless of what your research interest is, and make sure to include not only the most contemporary name, but also former versions of the names. And to get at those, Tyler's handouts that he's put in the Google Drive are going to be really helpful to get at those names. But I also recommend utilizing different keywords such as welfare, charities, advocacy, reform school, training school, hospital, asylum, and the like. Again, I think that this will help turn up other sources, and then you can investigate those sources further in the catalog to see if they overlap with your research interests. Now, you will also, as we mentioned, come across outmoded and harmful terms that exist within the records, and at times arise in the descriptions that librarians and archivists use. We're working on that as a field, but it is something to be aware of, as other folks have mentioned. So as far as doing research at the History Center, we are a non-circulating library and archives, meaning that you either have to come on site here in Pittsburgh, but you can also research from home. We certainly welcome that. And if you're interested, please do reach out to me, send me an email, and I can help you undertake some of this research. If you are able to come in and visit us in person, it is free. You do not have to pay museum admission. And we are currently by appointment only due to the pandemic. And I want to conclude just by, again, amplifying once more the grassroots organization that's dedicated to preserving disability history in our region. And that's the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium. In particular, one facet of their website I think is very relevant to all of you who have joined us here tonight, and it's under the Historic Resources tab. You can explore in a very user-friendly way the Western Pennsylvania Disability History collections that exist in different archives and libraries throughout our region and throughout the state. So with that, I am going to stop my share, and then I want to welcome back my fellow speakers for this evening. Wonderful. We do have a little bit of time for questions, and then we may just beg a little bit of an overage so we can look at some of these great questions that have come in. So one question I wanted to pose to kick things off is, how do you all think about the, an approach to the ethics of access to these records? How do you consider or balance issues of ethics, privacy, erasure, and consent in regards to these particular records? And I may pick on my fellow archivist to kick things off, Tyler, but I know Nathan has some really good stuff to say too.
That's a really hard question. I think for us at the state archives, we're limited because, there are state laws that dictate what cannot be released and what can be released. So that's where we have to start with. And I know we've worked with a lot of researchers, and that's a source of frustration for a lot of people, especially direct family members who are saying, this is my great-grandfather, and I want to see their records. And we have to say, well, legally, if you're not the executor of their estate because the records are this old, we're not able to supply access. And that's really hard. And, and as an archivist, I hate that, but that's, we're limited by those laws. But beyond that, I think we err on the side of opening up the records as much as we can, but being sensitive to records. And it's not as much of there's information that we want to hide, because that's certainly not our intent, but just records that are very intimate and they get into medical history and personal stories of these people who were in the institution. So we're very careful about making sure that people understand what's in the record when they're getting to it. So we just kind of prepare them for what's in it. So I think kind of for us, being available in the reference room for when people need assistance, kind of navigating the records, is how we try and provide the best access, kind of within the bounds of legally what we can put out there. But I'll just leave it at there, and I'll let Nathan and Dennis jump in from there.
Nathan?
Oh, don't get me started. I'll give the balanced answer first before I get on my soapbox. And that is that within, especially the field of critical disability studies, there's a large amount of questions, right? Legal questions, ethical questions, historical questions, theoretical questions that kind of surround these documents. And one example is a scholar by the name of Susan Birch, who's actually giving a lecture through the Consortium of History, Science, and Technology in Philly next week. If you're not aware, check that out. I'll try to put something in the chat. But she researches indigenous people who have been institutionalized, and her stance is completely antithetical to mine, and that is that these folks need to be remained anonymous, essentially, because it's about consent, and consent was never involved in any of this commitment process for these people. Why should that using of someone's name essentially assumes that consent is given when it's not? And so there are certainly a wide range of views on this. For me as a person, and I've had a number of conversations with Tyler about this, navigating the Pennsylvania State Archives policies for this, I'm of the opinion that all names should be used and not pseudonyms. In that, as a disabled person, we have names. We are human beings, and we deserve to have our stories be told. And I think that the bit around HIPAA and state privacy is kind of just a bunch of hooey. I think it's all a bunch of legal red tape that is certainly there for good reasons and nonetheless important, but is more erasure than it is privacy. And I question even more so not the privacy laws themselves, but who are the people that put those privacy laws in place?
No, I think that those are just fantastic reflections and insights. Dennis, is there anything you'd like to contribute? Or
yes.
Yeah.
I think it's going to depend on the nature of the records. We should accord to every human being the full rights of human dignity. And that includes not only their life, but also whatever records bear on them. There are HIPAA and state and institutional guidelines that sometimes serve us well and sometimes are used simply to avoid accountability. But there are guidelines that we have to adhere to. And I think depending upon the collection, you're going to run into different things. Temple University and their archive has tremendous collections that kind of parallel much of what Nathan and Tyler were talking about, and Sarah as well. And Temple has its own guidelines, and it operates within this kind of purview. So I think it depends on the nature of the records. It depends on the institution. One's personal papers, one's medical records. There's no sort of one rule of thumb that applies equally to everything. However, I think that the 75-year limitation is oftentimes reasonable, but I think we have to be very careful to assure that we are imparting dignity however we choose to open or keep closed records. And the best thing to do is to check with the institution's repositories and see what their policies are, lest you show up and not have access to anything.
Absolutely.
And there are also unrecorded gems that are out there in various places, and they don't even know they have them. So sometimes the fewer questions you ask, the more you have access to. So it's been my experience.
Great, thank you all. So we've talked a lot this evening about the limitations of these records that were created by the institutions. And one person asked, are we interested in records created by or from the perspective of institutionalized people? And so I can answer from the History Center and saying absolutely. The Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium has done some incredible work thus far in making connections to families whose lives intersect with institutionalization, and these families have different perspectives, and so there have been oral histories that have been recorded, and we are really interested in ensuring that the records themselves are diverse, and as much as we can, we do want records that truly reflect and capture the voice of institutionalized people. And again, just a glimpse into some of that work that we've done is looking at the slide relating to community inclusion. So this idea of the importance of having collections that are not just about, but by people with disabilities. And then, Tyler, as far as an archives perspective, or anybody else that'd like to chime in on this one.
Did you want me to go next, Sierra?
Yeah.
Sorry, I was reading through the questions here. Could you just repeat what the question was?
Yeah, sure. So this idea of, are you interested in records that were created by or represent the perspective of institutionalized people?
Okay, thanks for bringing me up to speed.
Yeah.
I wish that we had space in the state archives for everything so that we'd be a one-stop shop for all disability and institutional research, but that's just not possible. We're limited. And I think also, it's not within our kind of collection mission because we're primarily a state office and, a repository for state records. So that's what we focus on. And I think, there are a lot of other great facilities, Hines, Temple University, and there are other places as well. And I think having those places, and especially places like Hines and Temple that are affiliated with the disability rights movement and kind of the advocacy movement, having them kind of closer to the community as opposed to where I am, where we are a state facility, I think that's a more appropriate home for them, even though they're not physically in the same place. But with digitization, you can access things a lot easier these days. But I think, it's never going to happen that they're all in one place. Although, if somebody reached out to me and had a collection of records that somebody who's institutionalized created, I would not stop until I found the right home for them. I don't think they would be with us in Harrisburg, but I think that's part of our work to make sure that all of these records are preserved somewhere, and we would support that. So.
And again, this is just, if I could, Dennis, just real quick, just recall it again, if anybody is, if this sparks a collection in your mind and you're in the audience, please don't hesitate to reach out to Tyler or I. Our emails are in the handouts. And again, if we're not the right home, we do take it very seriously to help you find the right home for those materials. So yeah, Dennis.
Well, I'm just going to give a shout out to the Pennhurst Memorial Preservation Alliance, which is interested in and actually has its own records. And Mary Schreiner, who's at Alvernia and was a summer scholar in residence at the State Archives, has done some research and oral interviews, and certainly Lisa Sonnenberg at Temple with Visionary Voices, and now a new grant project that she has that will intentionally include people with disabilities throughout the entire structure of the grant. There are ongoing efforts to have people tell their own stories and to record them. So there are, new initiatives that will show the way to even greater possibilities in terms of creating an archive of remembrance in Pennsylvania for folks who lived the experience of being institutionalized, those who favored closing institutions and those who did not. So this is a rich field and there are projects underway.
No, and I really appreciate you raising those, Dennis. And a number of those are linked to in the resource list that is amongst the handouts. And again, we'll share that link again before the close of the evening. I do want to acknowledge that we've gone over a few minutes. If we could impose a little bit more, those of you that are still with us, we'll probably ask another question or so. We've established throughout this evening the sprawling nature of these institutions. After they close, of course, as Dennis mentioned, a key ethical and practical question emerges. What do you do with these properties, including the cemeteries on the grounds? So I'd love to hear your reflections and differing perspectives on this.
I think
well,
go ahead, Dennis. Go ahead.
I was just going to say that there are a large number of properties. There's Pennhurst. Norristown is substantially but not completely closed down. There's Allentown. As you go around the state, there are these state properties, and it is a public policy debate as well as an ethical debate about what are the appropriate uses or reuses. And there's a great division of opinion, and one can just focus on the Pennhurst Halloween Asylum venue as an example. but there are examples all around the country. How do you remember and give dignity to folks rather than perpetuating the indignities? But also, what does the state do with all these properties that they owned? And it's massive amounts of real estate. And how do you responsibly repurpose them? And this is a huge debate for Polk and Whitehaven, as it was for Pennhurst, and it will be at other places.
Yeah, if I could just, I'll follow up on that a little bit, Dennis. I guess I work for the state government. I feel like I don't really like represent the state though, but from what I've heard from staff internally, one of the big issues with these older facilities, because a lot of these buildings were built in the 19th century, they're full of asbestos and they're so old and a lot of them are falling apart. I know that was the case with, I think, some buildings that have recently been demolished at Norristown, which were late 19th century. Same with Allentown State Hospital. They just demolished pretty much the entire campus, and that was going back to, I think, 1904. But I know that's, at least that's the reasoning the state often gives, which is, you know, it's unfortunate. But I just wanted to say real quick, I know that there are others in other states. I think North Carolina and South Carolina actually come to mind, where they've taken former asylums and they've repurposed them and built them, changed them into parks and kind of like mixed. I think one has like a baseball stadium, another shopping and things like that in it. So some states have done that, but that's not really been the case in Pennsylvania, where they close an institution, it kind of gets, you know, repurposed for other government work. So another government office will maybe use some of the nicer buildings, but mostly they are neglected. And then 20 years later, they say, oh, well, this building is so far beyond repair that we have to demolish it. And that's kind of what's been happening in reality in Pennsylvania.
I just saw the Chelsea Chamberlain's point about Ann Parsons' wonderful book in the chat here, and I would just like to add that I guess I come from a more theoretical perspective on this issue than a practical one. In that, you know, again, I think it's important to dig into the complex notion of disability and how disability came about through the process of institutionalization. So inherently, the question of preservation, commemoration, and memorialization are inherently intertwined with institutionalization and disability and the powers that be that define those things and come to define those things. And I think it's a larger question for the disability community as a whole. Do we want these spaces that have defined many of our lives, whether we live there or not, or we know about them or not, to be defined by ourselves or by others, mixture of the both, and by the means in which we're used to, i.e. like we build a museum and we preserve this property, or something new, right? Or something in the middle. And there's a whole host of long, rambling philosophical questions I could dive into, but it is 8:12 and I'm going to spare the audience from that. But just to say, it's a lot to think about on a myriad of different levels.
Guy Caruso just made a good point in the chat about repurposing institutions to now become institutions for other incarcerated populations, i.e. prisons, and you know, selling things off for commercial reward, repurposing to warehouse other people, Halloween venues. The debate goes on. And behind it all is money.
And who gets that money?
That's right. Despite what state law sometimes says.
Well, again, I think that there's so many questions and further conversations that we dig into, but I'd like to cap us off with one more that kind of bring us up to the present. I want us all to consider as a group, you know, as a country and as a state, where are we with institutionalization today? What insights can we impart to our audience here this evening?
I'm just going to leave.
Well, I'll start by saying that the trend towards deinstitutionalization and closings continues in Pennsylvania and outside of Pennsylvania. And there are huge policy issues involved in that. And that this trend, and one of the great unspoken revolutions or transformations of the late 20th century is the movement back into the community, has not come without problems. And issues in the so-called system today, which are very alive and apparent. The greatest mistake we could make, I think, is a return to institutions. And three ethicists from Penn argued we should go back to institutions, just avoid the problems that existed before. I don't think that's a reasonable or wise course to take. But I think the trend towards deinstitutionalization will continue. And the question is, what are the services and supports that are necessary to assure that people experience success in a full life back in the community, or are they just being segregated in a different way? It's a huge public policy debate now.
If I may, I just taking a different tack on that, I completely agree with what Dr. Downey just said. But as a performance scholar and someone who's interested in looking at how we make media around these things and create stories around that media, all I have to say to the question of continuing institutionalization is, when was the last time you heard on the news about COVID-19 deaths in an institution? Right there, we have one. Right. And it's largely nursing homes that get the coverage for that. And that's certainly needed. I mean, elder care is not without its oversights and significant issues to be fixed. But we as a community, at least from what I can tell, and I mean, I never knew about institutionalization until I took my class in 2017. And that's because someone hit me over the broadside of a head with a book with it, right? I had no idea that that had happened, let alone in my state, let alone that I narrowly escaped such a fate. And it's just not something talked about. And I think that's inherent. I mean, Guy Caruso mentioned parents of children with autism putting, kids into these kind of cleaned up, more private homes that are essentially institutions. They're segregated away. We're not discussing from them. And I think that's the core question of institutionalization that we have yet to answer is, how do we view disabled people? And do we, to Dennis's opening question, do we view them as people? Do we view people like me as people? And if so, what does that mean for continuing institutionalization? And I get it. I certainly know that there are care needs and other things. Families just can't do it. There are sticky policy and public health related questions. But the sheer fact that we continue to rely on these institutions to put people away from the rest of society, I think gives the answer right there, especially when we're not willing to talk about it.
I just think those are incredibly powerful reflections to for all of us to dwell with, and also those in the audience to dwell with too. I wish we could go on, and I know that we could, but I think I just want to take a moment and thank you all so much for joining us this evening. And before we sign off, I just want to thank again my fellow panelists, Dennis, Tyler, and Nathan, for their expertise and also the care that they brought to this event. I want to thank again the Western Pennsylvania Disability History and Action Consortium for their ongoing guidance and the partnership that has resulted in the History Center having the honor to collaborate on the preservation of disability history in our region. I also want to take a moment and thank Cindy, our live captioner, and Allison, our incredible ASL interpreter, as well as Mary Ruth Leftwich and some of my colleagues at the Heinz History Center for their role in assisting me with this event, including Sarah Reck, Brady Smith, Kim Roberts, Mary Jones, Ann Mataraz, Amanda McCallan, Liz Dewar, Eric Lidgy, Matt Strauss, and Laura Myers. Just a reminder again that handouts and a resource list are available to guide your research further. I'll share a link once more to these files in the chat. Thank you so much again, everyone. Thanks for hanging with us. I sincerely wish you and yours continued good health and safety. And I hope you all have a wonderful rest of your evening. Thank you.
Thank you, Sierra. Thanks all.
Thanks, Sierra.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you, Sierra.
Mhm.
Thank you, Allison.